Chapter 1. Arrogance and the Cruel Act. The courtroom was silent until the sound of scissors slicing through hair echoed like a gunshot. Sharp and unforgiving, as Officer James Harrow grinned at the sight of the black woman's locks falling to the floor. No one had expected a routine hearing in Atlanta to erupt into chaos. Least of all the woman kneeling before him, her dignity stripped bare in front of a stunned crowd. It was March 15, 2025, a humid afternoon in Georgia, and the air inside the small courtroom of the Fulton County Superior Court hung heavy with tension. James Harrow, a towering figure in his crisp blue uniform, stood over her, his square jaw set tight, his pale blue eyes glinting with something dark, arrogance, maybe, or something uglier. He'd spent 20 years on the force, building a reputation as the kind of cop who didn't just enforce the law but bent it to his will. Especially when it came to certain kinds of people. The hearing had started simply enough, a minor case about a black man accused of disturbing the peace. James had been called as a witness, his report claiming the suspect had resisted arrest, but the presiding judge, a woman with deep brown skin and a commanding presence, had dared to question him. Her name was Eleanor Brooks, though James didn't know that yet. All he saw was a black woman in a robe who didn't belong. In his mind, behind that bench, "Your report says he swung at you, Officer Harrow," she'd said, her voice steady, cutting through his rehearsed testimony. "But the body cam footage shows him with his hands up. Care to explain?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was worse. It was calm, deliberate, like she already knew the truth and was just waiting for him to trip over his own lies. James felt the heat rise in his chest. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not by anyone, and certainly not by her. He'd dealt with judges before, old white men who nodded multiple stories, who trusted a cop's word over some thugs, but this was different. This was personal. Earlier that morning, in the precinct break room, he'd muttered to his partner, "Mike, she thinks she's somebody just 'cause they stuck her in that chair." Mike, a wiry guy with a buzz cut and a smirk, had chuckled. "Diversity hire, huh? Maybe she needs a reminder who really runs things around here." The words had lingered in James's head all day, festering like an open wound. Now, standing in the courtroom, her questions gnawing at him, James snapped. He didn't plan it, not exactly, but the rage took over. And before he knew it, he'd lunged forward. The bailiff had stepped out for a moment, leaving a bag of confiscated items unattended near the witness stand. James spotted a pair of scissors inside, the kind used to cut evidence tags, and grabbed them. The room gasped as he seized Eleanor by her long, thick hair, yanking her from the bench and forcing her to her knees. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "You think you get to sit up there and judge me?" The scissors flashed in his hand, and with a single, brutal snip, the first strands of her hair hit the floor. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, lawyers, jurors, onlookers, all frozen in disbelief. A young clerk dropped her pen, her hands trembling. An older attorney half stood, then sat back down, his face pale. No one moved to stop him. They couldn't. James Harrow was a cop, a man with a badge, a man who'd walked these halls like he owned them. The sound of the scissors was deafening, each cut a deliberate act of humiliation. "This is what happens when you forget your place," he muttered, dragging the blades across her scalp. Her hair fell in clumps, dark and heavy against the cold tile, a stark contrast to the polished wood of the judge's bench. He expected her to scream, to beg, to break, but she didn't. Eleanor Brooks didn't flinch. She didn't cry out or claw at his hands. She knelt there, her chin high, her dark eyes locked on his with a quiet defiance that made his stomach twist. It wasn't fear he saw in her gaze, it was something else. Something that made his grip tighten and his breath catch. "You people," he spat, shaking his head, "always acting like you belong where you don't." He stepped back, tossing the scissors onto the bench with a clatter, admiring his work. "There, now you look like what you are." The courtroom was a tomb, the air thick with shock and horror. A woman in the jury box covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. A guard near the door shifted uneasily, his hand hovering over his radio but not pressing the button. James smirked, waiting for the collapse he was sure would come. He'd seen it before, people crumbling under his weight. under his authority. But then Eleanor smiled. It wasn't a broken smile or a desperate one. It was small, steady, knowing. Like she held a secret he couldn't fathom. The sight of it sent a flicker of unease through him, though he shoved it down. "What's so funny?" he snapped, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look up at him. Her smile didn't waver. "Are you finished, Officer Harrow?" she asked, her voice calm and measured, cutting through the silence like a blade. He blinked, thrown off. "What?" "I asked if you're finished," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "Because if you are, I'd like to get back to my courtroom." The words hung in the air, heavy and electric. Confusion flashed across James's face, his grip loosening. "You're what?" he stammered. Slowly, Eleanor rose to her feet, brushing off her robe as if his hands had left nothing more than dust. She stepped past him, her movements deliberate, and reached for the black judicial robe draped over her chair. "You heard me," she said, her voice ringing clear. "You just assaulted the presiding judge of this court." The room erupted, not in sound, but in realization. James's face drained of color as the weight of her words sank in. Gasps broke the silence, sharp and uneven. "No way," someone whispered from the back. The guard finally pressed his radio, his voice low and urgent. Eleanor pulled the robe over her shoulders, fastening it with a quiet authority that filled the space. She turned to face James, her presence no longer just a woman he'd tried to break but a wall of justice he couldn't climb. "You wanted to show me my place," she said, stepping closer, her voice steady and unyielding. "Tell me, Officer Harrow, how does it feel now?" James stumbled back, his breath shallow, his mind racing for a way out. But there was none. The doors burst open, and a flood of uniformed figures stormed in. Internal Affairs, their faces hard and unreadable. The courtroom watched as the man who'd thought he was untouchable became the one trapped, his arrogance unraveling in real time. Eleanor stood tall, her shaved head a badge of resilience. And James Harrow realized too late that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Chapter 2. The Fall and the Confrontation. The metallic clank of handcuffs snapping around James Harrow's wrists rang out like a death knell, a sound that drowned out the fading gasps of the courtroom. Officer James Harrow, once the man who'd strode through Atlanta's precincts like a king, now stood powerless as internal affairs officers dragged him from the room. His uniform crumpled and his pride shattered. The air outside the Fulton County Superior Court was thick with humidity, but it felt colder than ever as he was shoved into a patrol car, the doors slamming shut behind him. The reporters were already there, cameras flashing, their lenses capturing the moment his world collapsed. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor Brooks had stood unshaken, her shaved head a testament to her resilience, her voice still echoing in his ears. "How does it feel now?" He didn't have an answer then, and he didn't have one now. The ride to Fulton County Detention Center was a blur. James sat in the back, his hands bound, his mind scrambling for a lifeline. He'd been in tough spots before, complaints filed, investigations opened, but he'd always walked away. His buddies in the precinct had his back, the system had his back. If she wasn't a judge, this'd be buried by morning. One of his old partners had muttered as James was led out, a half-hearted defense that stung more than it helped. It was true, though. How many times had he roughed up some black kid in the wrong neighborhood, filed a flimsy report, and watched it disappear? Too many to count. But this time, the cameras had caught everything. And the woman he'd humiliated wasn't just anyone. She was Judge Eleanor Brooks, and that changed the game. The detention center loomed ahead, a gray fortress of concrete and steel, its gates locking behind him with a finality that made his stomach drop. The internal affairs officers handed him over to the guards without a word, their faces blank, their silence heavier than any accusation. Inside, the process was quick and brutal. Fingerprints, mugshot, strip search. The guards didn't look at him like a cop. They treated him like any other inmate. Maybe worse. One of them, a black man with a scar over his eyebrow, took his time checking James's pockets, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thought you were untouchable, huh?" the guard muttered under his breath, just loud enough for James to hear. James clenched his jaw but said nothing. He couldn't, not yet. They shoved him into a holding cell, the door slamming shut with a clang that reverberated through the block. The air was stale, thick with the smell of sweat and despair. He wasn't alone. Across the cell, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, was Darnell Jackson. James knew the face, dark skin, sharp eyes, a faint scar running down his cheek. 2 years ago, James had stopped Darnell for walking in the wrong area. A flimsy excuse he'd used a dozen times before. When Darnell questioned him, James had snapped, cuffed him, slammed him against a wall, and left him with a cracked rib and a night in a cell without medical care. Should have stayed in your lane, James had sneered back then, walking away without a second thought. Now, Darnell was the one smirking. Well, damn, Darnell said, his voice low and smooth, dripping with something between amusement and menace. Never thought I'd see you in here, Harrow. James straightened, forcing his shoulders back, clinging to the scraps of authority he still believed he had. Shut it, he snapped, his tone sharp but hollow. Darnell chuckled, pushing off the wall and taking a step closer. Nah, I don't think I will. See, I got questions, like how it feels to be on this side of the bars for once. James glared at him, his pulse quickening, but he didn't answer. Darnell tilted his head, studying him. You remember me, don't you? Night on Peachtree, cold as hell. You decided I looked suspicious. Beat me till I couldn't breathe right for a month. Ring any bells? James's throat tightened. He remembered, vaguely, but it was just another night. Another report, another name in a file he'd tossed aside. You were out of line, he muttered, the old excuse slipping out like muscle memory. Darnell's smirk faded, his eyes hardening. Out of line? I was walking home, man, but that didn't matter to you. Did it? Never does with guys like you. You see black skin and a hoodie, and suddenly it's open season. The words hit harder than James expected, stirring something uneasy in his chest. He'd heard it before, complaints, protests, sob stories, but it had never stuck. It was just noise. Now, though, locked in here with Darnell's stare boring into him, it wasn't so easy to brush off. The cell block wasn't quiet for long. Whispers spread like wildfire. That's Harrow, the cop who messed with the judge, and soon enough, other inmates were peering through the bars, their voices carrying down the hall. Ain't that the bastard who busted up Tyrone's knee? One called out. Yeah, and he's in here now? Oh, this is gonna be good. Another laughed, dark and mean. James felt their eyes on him, a weight pressing down, suffocating. He'd walked these halls before, baton in hand, barking orders, watching men shrink under his gaze. Now the roles were reversed, and the fear he'd once wielded was nowhere to be found. Later that day, in the yard, it got worse. A group of inmates cornered him near the chain-link fence, their shadows looming over the cracked pavement. One of them, a wiry guy with tattoos snaking up his neck, stepped forward. You're Harrow, right? The cop who thought he could play God. James braced himself, his fists clenching, knowing a fight was coming. The man cracked his knuckles, his grin widening. I owe you for my cousin. Man, you locked him up for nothing. Left him with a limp. Guess it's payback time. The others closed in, the air crackling with tension, and James felt his heart slam against his ribs. He'd been in scraps before, but always with backup, always with power. Not now. Then Darnell appeared, stepping between them with a casual ease that belied the situation. Not today, he said, his voice firm but calm. The tattooed guy frowned. The hell you mean? This punk deserves it. Darnell didn't flinch. Yeah, maybe, but you swing now. You're the one in solitary. Not him. Let his own mess catch up with him. It's already working. There was a long, heavy pause, the group sizing Darnell up. Then the leader shrugged. Fine, he's lucky, for now. They backed off, but their eyes promised more to come. James exhaled, his hands still trembling, and turned to Darnell. Why'd you do that? He asked, his voice rough, uncertain. Darnell met his gaze, unflinching. You ain't worth me getting locked up over, he said simply, but don't get it twisted. Harrow, this ain't over. You're just starting to feel what it's like down here. James swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking deep. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't in years, fear, and it was only the beginning. Chapter 3. the reckoning and the chance. The steel doors of Fulton County Detention Center groaned open, and James Harrow stepped into the blinding sunlight, his shadow stretching thin and fragile across the cracked pavement. Nearly a year had passed since that day in the courtroom, since the scissors had flashed and his life had unraveled. And now he stood outside, not free. Not yet, but different. The air smelled of gasoline and dust, a sharp contrast to the stale rot of the cell he'd called home for 11 months. His wrists bore faint red marks from the cuffs, a reminder of the weight he'd carried. But it was the weight inside, guilt, fear, and something new, something raw, that pressed harder. Inside, Judge Eleanor Brooks had given him a chance, a reduction in his sentence, a transfer to a community rehabilitation program. Punishment's only useful if it builds something better, she'd told him, her voice steady as ever. James hadn't argued. For once, he'd listened. The months behind bars had been a slow, grinding descent. At first, he'd clung to denial, telling himself the system would pull him out, his old precinct buddies, a slick lawyer, someone, but no one came. The silence from the outside was louder than the jeers of the inmates, a deafening proof that he'd been abandoned. He'd heard the stories in the yard, whispered between men with scars and tired eyes. Black men stopped for driving nice cars in white neighborhoods, questioned for jogging at dusk, frisked for no reason but the color of their skin. Just another day, one guy had shrugged, his voice flat. James had tuned out those complaints before, dismissing them as excuses. Now, locked in with them, he couldn't look away. He saw the pattern, the one he'd been part of, and it gnawed at him like rust on steel. Darnell Jackson had been the mirror he couldn't escape. Their first nights in the cell were tense, Darnell watching him with a quiet intensity that made James's skin crawl. But Darnell didn't strike, not with fists. Anyway, his weapon was words. "You ever think about us as people?" he'd asked one night, his voice low, cutting through the hum of the prison. "Or were we just targets to you?" James hadn't answered. Not then. He'd stared at the ceiling, the question looping in his head. Over time, he'd started writing, scribbled notes on scraps of paper. Things he remembered, things he'd done, beating Darnell for asking a question, planting weed on a kid who'd mouthed off, laughing over beers about cleaning up the streets. The pages piled up, a ledger of shame he couldn't burn away. The other inmates hadn't forgotten him either. The white guys shunned him, calling him a traitor for falling so far. The black prisoners saw him as a ghost of their past, a living symbol of every cop who'd crossed their paths. He'd taken beatings, quick, brutal ones in the showers or the yard, but Darnell had kept the worst at bay. "You're not worth the trouble," he'd said once, pulling James out of a scuffle, his grip firm but not cruel. James didn't thank him. He didn't know how, but something shifted. He stopped fighting the stares, stopped pretending he was above it all. He listened. He saw, and slowly, he began to understand what he'd been too blind to see before. Then came the day Eleanor Brooks walked back into his life. He'd been called to the warden's office, expecting more charges or bad news, his stomach tight with dread. Instead, she stood there, arms crossed, her presence as commanding as it had been behind the bench. Her hair had grown back, a short, tight crop framing her face. But her eyes were the same, sharp, unyielding. "You've been here almost a year, Harrow," she said, her tone flat, like she was stating a fact to a clerk. He nodded, his shackled hands resting in his lap. "Had time to think?" she asked. Stepping closer, he swallowed, his throat dry. "Yeah," he rasped. "More than I wanted." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "The system isn't built for redemption," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "It chews people up, spits them out, and calls it justice. But people? They can change, if they choose to." She leaned forward, her gaze locking with his. "Your sentence is being reduced. You'll go to a rehabilitation program, community service, education, supervision. You'll work harder than you ever have. And you'll answer for what you've done. This isn't freedom, Harrow. It's a chance. What you do with it is up to you." James frowned, the words sinking in slow and heavy. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She straightened, her expression unreadable. "Because I'd rather see you fix something than rot." Before she left, She slid a folder across the table, thick, worn, stuffed with papers. "What's this?" he asked, his hands trembling as he opened it. "Your cases," she said simply. "The ones you buried, the ones you broke. Start with Darnell Jackson." She turned to go, pausing at the door. "Face them, Harrow. That's where it begins." The door clicked shut, and James stared at the folder, his breath shallow. Inside were names, dates, reports, lives he'd appended without a second thought. Darnell's file was on top, a photo of him bruised and bloodied. James's signature scrawled at the bottom. His stomach churned, but he didn't look away. A week later, he walked out. The program wasn't a gift, it was grueling. 12-hour days cleaning streets, teaching kids about the law he'd once twisted, living under a parole officer's thumb. But it was air, it was light, it was something he hadn't had in months. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he caught sight of Darnell across the street. Free now, working at a community center. Their eyes met, and Darnell gave a slight nod, not forgiveness, not friendship, but an acknowledgement. James nodded back, a silent promise to himself that this time, he'd try. The sun beat down, harsh and unrelenting, but James didn't flinch. He wasn't the man who'd stormed into that courtroom a year ago. Scissors in hand, arrogance in his veins. He couldn't undo the past, the lives he'd scarred, the trust he'd broken, but he could choose what came next. Eleanor had been right. Punishment alone was empty. It was what you built from it that mattered. Standing there, the folder tucked under his arm, he felt the weight of it all, his crimes, his chance, his truth. For the first time, he didn't run from it. Life had a way of stripping you bare, leaving you with nothing but who you were. James Harrow had thought he was untouchable, a king in a uniform, until the crown fell and the mirror cracked. Now, with the world wide open and his hands empty, he had a question to answer. What would he build from the wreckage? The road ahead was long, steep, and uncertain, but he took the first step anyway, not because he had to, but because he chose to.